Harold Whitmore's voice cut through the cold Wyoming air like a blade. "Get back on that train." He didn't lower his voice. He didn't step closer to spare her dignity. He stood on the platform in front of every soul in Cedar Ridge and said it again, louder, so the men near the livery stable could hear, so the women clustered by the depot windows could press their faces to the glass and watch. "You're not what I asked for. You're not what I was promised." Evelyn Hartwell hadn't moved yet. Her trunk sat at her feet. Her traveling coat was dusty from 3 days on the rails. She had rehearsed this moment 100 times, stepping off the train, seeing his face, beginning a life. She had not rehearsed this. The crowd on the platform went quiet in that particular way crowds go quiet when they're embarrassed, but don't intend to leave. If you've ever been made small in front of people who couldn't look away, subscribe to this channel and stay until the end. Because what happens next in Cedar Ridge will remind you that the people this world tries to throw away sometimes become the ones it cannot forget. Hit that like button and drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The train from Cheyenne had been delayed by 6 hours outside of Laramie, something to do with a water tower that had partially frozen, and a crew that spent the better part of a morning arguing about whose responsibility it was to fix it. Evelyn had sat in the second-to-last car with her trunk wedged against her knees and a woman named Mrs. Dorchester beside her who had strong opinions about the moral failings of the Western Territories and shared them continuously for 4 hours until she fell asleep with her mouth open and her bonnet tilted sideways. Evelyn had been grateful for the silence, not because she was unfriendly. She was in fact a person who had once enjoyed conversation very much, who had been known in her Philadelphia neighborhood for a particular quick wit that could make her mother laugh until she had to set down her teacup. But that had been before the fever, before the long weeks in the sick room when the infection settled into her throat and did what infections sometimes do to the soft tissue there, not killing her outright, which might have been a mercy in certain dark moments, but leaving her diminished, rearranged. Her voice had come back eventually in the way a river comes back after a drought, present, but nothing like it was before. She could speak. She could make herself understood, but it cost her something every time, a roughness and a thinness to the sound that made strangers lean in and then look away as if they'd witnessed something they weren't meant to. She had told Harold about this in her third letter. She had been specific. She wrote, "I must tell you something before we go further. 3 years ago, I suffered a severe illness that damaged my voice. I speak in a whisper now, more or less. I am not an invalid. I am not incapable. But I am not the same woman I was before, and you deserve to know that before you make any decision." Harold had written back within the week. He said it didn't matter. He said what he was looking for was a woman of character and industry, not a woman of performance. He used the word substance. He used the phrase refined Eastern sensibilities. He asked about her family, her education, her opinion on the proper way to keep household accounts. And when she answered all of it carefully and honestly, he sent a train ticket and a date. She had read that letter enough times that the fold lines had gone soft. She was reading it again, actually, just before the train pulled into Cedar Ridge, not because she needed to, she had it memorized, but because she needed something to do with her hands. The depot appeared through the frost-clouded window, a low wooden structure with a hand-painted sign, and she could see the small crowd gathered on the platform. People came out for arrivals in small towns. There was nothing unusual about that. She had put the letter away. She had straightened her collar. She had made herself breathe. Harold Whitmore was not hard to identify. He had described himself accurately: tall, broad through the shoulders, dark coat, clean-shaved. He was standing near the edge of the platform with 2 men she didn't know flanking him like bookends, both of them with the particular posture of men who expected to be impressed. He was watching the train with his arms loose at his sides and an expression she couldn't quite read through the window glass. She had smiled. She couldn't help it. After all the letters, after all the months of imagining, here was the person. Here was the real beginning. She stepped off the train. She watched Harold's face change. It happened the way things happen sometimes, not all at once, but in a sequence of small recalibrations, each one slightly worse than the last. His eyes moved from expectation to recognition to something she didn't want to name. He took 1 step toward her and then stopped. His jaw tightened. "Miss Hartwell?" he said. His voice was flat. She nodded. She said his name. It came out the way it always did now, thin and scratched at the edges, and she saw him flinch at the sound of it. Not a small flinch, a full-body thing he didn't bother to hide. The crowd on the platform was very still. "You didn't tell me," Harold said. She had opened her mouth to respond, to remind him, to say, "But I did. In the third letter, I was very clear." But he didn't wait. "You didn't tell me," he said again, louder this time, the way people repeat things when they want witnesses. "You wrote to me about yourself and you left out the most important part. That's a deception. That's a woman who deceives." She heard the women by the depot window. She heard the shift in the crowd's breathing. "I told you," she said. It came out as barely more than breath, which made it worse, which she knew would make it worse, which made her furious at herself for caring about that right now. "No." Harold's face had gone red at the collar. "What you wrote was, you buried it. You made it sound like nothing. You didn't tell me what it would actually sound like, what it would look like, having a wife who—" He stopped, and in the pause the two men beside him exchanged a glance that she would remember for a long time. "I run a business," he said, working to make his voice reasonable, measured, the voice of a man being perfectly fair. "I have standing in this community. I need someone who can— People come to my home, Miss Hartwell. My customers, my associates. I need a wife who can hold a conversation, who can participate." "I can participate," she said. And he looked at her. The crowd looked at him, looking at her. "Get back on that train," he said. She didn't get back on the train. This was a fact that seemed to surprise Harold more than it surprised anyone else. He had said it with the certainty of a man accustomed to instructions being followed, and when Evelyn simply stood there with her hand on her trunk and her eyes on his face, something shifted in his expression from contempt to something adjacent to unease. "Miss Hartwell, I have traveled," she said carefully, putting the words out one at a time because the effort required it, "for 3 days. I spent my savings on this journey. You sent me a ticket and a proposal, and I accepted in good faith. I am not getting back on that train." A woman near the depot door laughed quickly and then pressed her hand to her mouth. Harold looked at the crowd. He looked at his two associates, who were suddenly studying the middle distance. He looked at Evelyn. "Then that's your problem," he said, and he turned and walked off the platform, and the crowd parted for him the way crowds part for men who own things, and then he was gone. Evelyn stood there with her trunk. The platform emptied in the particular way platforms empty after something uncomfortable, quickly, with people finding reasons to be elsewhere. Conversations started up at a volume slightly too high, boots suddenly very purposeful on the wooden boards. Within 10 minutes, she was standing alone, except for a teenage boy who worked for the depot and was making a show of not looking at her while he moved a cart back and forth with no apparent destination. She sat down on her trunk. She was not going to cry. She decided this clearly and specifically, not as a performance for anyone watching, because no one was watching, but as a decision she made for herself, the way she had made a series of decisions over the past 3 years that all boiled down to the same basic thing: she was still here. Whatever else was true, she was still here, and that had to be worth something. What she did instead of crying was think about money. She had $11.40. She had a trunk containing 3 dresses, 2 changes of underclothes, her sewing kit, 3 spools of good thread, a pair of scissors that had belonged to her mother, and a small leather case containing the letters Harold Whitmore had sent her over the course of 7 months, which she now considered throwing into the first available fire. She had a return ticket she could use. She could be back in Philadelphia in 4 days. She could go back to the small room she'd rented above Mrs. Aldrich's house and the piecework she'd been doing for a tailor on Chestnut Street that paid just enough to keep her from being a burden on her brother and his wife, who had already done more than she could reasonably ask of anyone. She sat there for a while thinking about what she was going back to, and then she picked up her trunk and walked into Cedar Ridge. The town was not what she'd imagined from Harold's letters, which had been generous with adjectives and careful with specific details. Cedar Ridge was 2 streets wide and 6 streets long, built in the practical, graceless way of frontier towns that come into being, because a railroad stops there and never develop much aesthetic ambition beyond that. The buildings were mostly wooden with false fronts that made them look slightly taller than they were. A civic optimism expressed in lumber. There was a general store, a hotel, a livery, a land office, a barber shop, a doctor's office, with a hand-painted shingle that had weathered to illegibility, 2 saloons, and at the far end of the main street, a church that needed new paint. She walked up the main street carrying her trunk because she had no money for the livery's cart service, and her arms ached by the time she made it to the hotel. The woman behind the hotel desk was perhaps 60, with the kind of face that doesn't give much away and probably never did. "I need a room," Evelyn said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "I have money for 2 nights. I'm hoping to find work before the end of the week." The woman looked at her. The woman's name was Alma Breyer, as Evelyn would learn later, and she was the widow of the man who had built the hotel and the mother of the man who currently ran it, and the grandmother of 4 children she described as energetic, which Evelyn would eventually understand was Alma's word for everything that tried her patience. "Harold Whitmore's girl," Alma said. It wasn't a question. "I'm nobody's girl," Evelyn said. Something moved across Alma's face that might have been the very early stages of approval. $2.50 a night, breakfast included if you're down before 7. She turned to get the key. "Word of advice since you're new. Don't go to Harold Whitmore looking for the trunk fare back to wherever you came from. He'll make you feel like you owe him for asking." "I wasn't planning to," Evelyn said. She took the key and went upstairs. She found the dressmaker on her second morning. Her name was Margaret Doyle, and her shop was tucked between the general store and what had once been a milliner's and was now a storage space for someone's agricultural equipment. Margaret was a small, precise woman who moved with the economy of someone who had learned not to waste motion because there was always more to do than time allowed. She had a daughter somewhere in Colorado and a husband who had died of a rattlesnake bite 7 years prior, and she talked about both of these facts with equal matter-of-factness, as if grief and geography occupied the same emotional register. Evelyn asked for work. Margaret said she'd already heard about the situation at the train station. Everyone had, which was the nature of small places, and asked to see Evelyn's hands. It was an unusual request. Most people asked to see samples. Evelyn showed her hands. They were not delicate hands. They had the small calluses of someone who had been doing fine handwork for years, and the particular way the skin lay over the knuckles that comes from holding tension in thread and needle for long hours. "Sit down," Margaret said. She put a length of navy wool in front of Evelyn and watched while Evelyn examined it, checked the weight, held it up to the light from the window. "What are you seeing?" Margaret asked. "It pulls right," Evelyn said, or whispered it rather, which was all she could manage. "The weave. It'll bias if you cut it on the straight grain. You'd want to go diagonal for anything fitted." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "That's not something most women know," she said. "I learned from my aunt. She had a shop in Philadelphia." "Can you do buttonholes that lay flat?" "Yes." "Can you fit a woman who's built crooked?" "Most women are built a little crooked. Most dressmakers pretend they aren't." "I've been fitting women since I was 15, Evelyn said. "I've met about 4 who were actually symmetrical." Margaret pulled a half-finished dress from the pile on her cutting table. It had been pinned at the side seams and abandoned, and Evelyn could see immediately why. The person it was made for carried her left shoulder lower than her right, and whoever had started the work had ignored it. "Fix it," Margaret said. Evelyn unpinned the shoulder seam, assessed the structure, and spent the next 40 minutes recutting and repinning while Margaret watched from her stool with her arms crossed and her expression giving nothing away. When she was done, Margaret looked at the dress for a long time. $1.50 a week, Margaret said. "You can use the back room to sleep if you want to save the hotel money. It's not comfortable, but it's not the street." "That's fair," Evelyn said. She had been working for Margaret for 11 days when she met Silas Bennett. She was at the front of the shop. Margaret had let her take over the window display, which had previously featured a dress form wearing a garment, so out of date it was nearly archaeological. When a man came through the door, he was perhaps 40, maybe a few years past, with the particular physical economy of someone who has spent years doing work that rewards efficiency over flourish. His coat was well made and had been well maintained, which told her something. His hands, when he reached up to remove his hat, were the hands of a working rancher, which told her something else. He was looking at the rack of finished garments along the side wall when she turned to greet him. She said, "Good morning," the usual thin, scraped sound. He didn't respond. He kept examining the garments, moving along the rack with the methodical interest of someone who knew what they were looking for. She thought for a moment he was being rude. She was accustomed to people who chose not to engage with her voice once they heard it, but there was nothing dismissive in his manner. He was simply focused. When he turned and found her watching him, he did something unexpected. He raised his hands and made a gesture she didn't recognize, then paused, reading her face, and apparently reading in it that she didn't understand, because he dropped his hands and reached instead into his coat pocket and produced a small notebook and a stub of pencil. "Looking for a riding skirt," he wrote. "Made for a woman about your height. Working garment. Needs to hold up." He turned the notebook toward her. She read it. She looked up at him. She reached over to the counter where Margaret kept the shop's small chalkboard. They used it for pricing sometimes, and picked up the chalk. "Can you give me measurements? Or is she in town?" He read it. Something shifted in his expression, a brief recalibration similar to what she'd seen in Harold's face, but moving in an entirely different direction. He wrote, "She's not in town. I can estimate. She's my foreman's wife. Broad through the hips, narrow shoulder. About this tall." He held his hand at a height beside himself. They went back and forth like that for 20 minutes. She showed him 3 different fabric weights. He had opinions about all of them, which she hadn't expected, but she was learning not to make assumptions. He ended up choosing a heavy cotton twill in a dark brown that would show dirt less, which was the practical choice. And she took down the measurements he estimated and said, she wrote it, that the skirt would be ready in 4 days, and would he like to come back or should she send word? He wrote his name and the name of his ranch, Silas Bennett, the Rocking Bee, 8 miles north. She wrote her name. He read it. He wrote, "You're new here." "Yes," she wrote. He looked at her for a moment with the kind of attention that wasn't pity. She had developed, over 3 years, a very precise internal instrument for distinguishing between attention that was pity and attention that was something else. This was something else. He was simply looking at her the way a person looks when they're actually seeing you. Then he put his hat back on and left. Margaret, who had been listening from the back room with a frankness she didn't bother to disguise, came out when the bell over the door had finished ringing. "Silas Bennett," she said, settling onto her stool. "Been deaf since he was born, or so they say. Grew up on his father's ranch and apparently decided early that the world was going to make room for him whether it wanted to or not." She picked up her thimble. "He's one of the wealthiest ranchers in the county, also one of the most stubborn. People used to underestimate him terribly when he was young. I imagine some still do, to their regret." Evelyn was folding the sample fabrics. "He seemed capable enough." "He is. He also reads people well, better than most hearing folks, from what I can tell. Comes from paying attention in a different way, I expect." Margaret pushed her needle through the seam she was working on. "His mother taught him to read lips, but he says it's inexact. He mostly uses the notebook." She paused. "You didn't seem bothered by the notebook." "Why would I be?" Margaret gave her the particular look she gave when she considered a question answered. "Well, he came back for the riding skirt on the 4th day. The skirt fit the measurements. Evelyn had added a small detail she hadn't mentioned, a reinforced panel along the inner thigh where the wear from the saddle would hit first, because he'd mentioned it was a working garment and she'd thought about what that actually meant. He examined it carefully. He examined the seams, the hem, the reinforced panel, and then he looked at her. He wrote, "You added this." She wrote, "It'll last longer." He wrote, "She'll appreciate it." "How much more?" She'd already factored it into the price. She shook her head and wrote, "Same price." It didn't take extra time. He looked at that for a moment. He wrote, "It took thought. That has a value." She didn't quite know what to do with that, so she wrote the total, and he paid it, and then stood there for a moment with his hat in his hands, and she could see him deciding something. He wrote, "There's a thing I should tell you. A warning, I suppose. Harold Whitmore has been talking. About you." She'd heard some of it already. Cedar Ridge was not a large town, and word moved through it like weather. She wrote, "I know." He wrote, "Does it change what you're planning to do?" She wrote, "No." He looked at that answer for a long time, longer than it warranted if he was just reading it, which meant he was thinking about it. He wrote, "Good." And then he left, and she stood at the counter for a moment with the chalk still in her hand, and she thought about the word good and what it had taken for someone to say it to her, without pity, without agenda, without the performance of reassurance. Just good. The way you'd say it to a person who you simply expected to be fine. She hadn't realized, until right then, how long it had been since someone had looked at her that way. Harold Whitmore came into the shop on a Thursday afternoon, 10 days after that. He did it in a way that was almost casual. Browsing, he said, looking for a gift for his housekeeper's birthday. Though everyone in Cedar Ridge knew Harold's housekeeper was a 60-year-old man named Pete who had once punched a mule and won, and was unlikely to be the recipient of gifts involving fabric. Evelyn was the only one in the shop. Margaret had gone to the doctor's office about her left knee. Harold looked around for a moment, and then he looked at her. "I wanted to see how you were getting on," he said. His voice had the particular warmth of a man performing concern. "I've been feeling badly about the situation at the station. It was poorly handled on my part." She looked at him and said nothing, because she was behind the counter and the chalkboard was at the other end of it, and she wasn't going to perform the pantomime of fetching it for him. Harold took this as an invitation to continue. "The thing is, Miss Hartwell, I was caught off guard. I'd built up an idea of what things would look like, and I reacted badly. I can admit that." He turned a spool of ribbon over in his hands without looking at it. "I think it might be worth discussing whether there's a more sensible arrangement. You're clearly intelligent, you're clearly capable, and it's a hard town for a woman on her own." She waited. "What I'm suggesting," Harold said carefully, "is that I might be willing to revisit the original arrangement, under modified terms, of course, appropriate to the actual situation." He set the ribbon down. "You wouldn't need to work here. You'd have a comfortable home, security, what every woman of sense should want." She picked up the chalk. She wrote, "I'm not interested." Harold read it. His expression didn't change immediately. He had good control over his expressions. "I think you should consider—" She turned the chalkboard around and wrote on the other side, "Please leave the shop." His face changed then. The warmth went first, and underneath it was something harder and flatter, which she suspected was what had always been there. "You're making a mistake," he said. A woman in your position." She wrote, "Margaret will be back shortly." He left. She stood behind the counter until she heard the bell stop ringing, and then she sat down on Margaret's stool and put her hands flat on the counter and breathed. She was shaking, she noticed, not from fear exactly, from the particular strain of holding yourself together in front of someone who wants to see you fall apart. She had spent a great deal of the past 3 years practicing that kind of endurance, and she was good at it, but it cost her every time. She was still sitting there when Margaret came back. Margaret looked at her. Margaret looked at the door. Margaret sat down and picked up her sewing. "Harold was here," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "Did he offer you the modified arrangement?" Evelyn looked at her. "Has he done that before?" "He's done it to 4 women I know of, over the years. Women who were in one kind of trouble or another and needed a solution. He likes to be the solution. Makes him feel large." Margaret ran her needle through the cloth. "He usually waits until they're a little more desperate than you seem to be." "I'm not desperate," Evelyn said. "No," Margaret said. "I can see that." Or, it was Margaret who mentioned the following week that Silas Bennett had asked about the shop. Not about any particular garment, just generally. Asked Margaret how things were going, how Evelyn was settling in, whether she seemed to be managing all right. "Did he say why?" Evelyn asked. "He doesn't explain himself much," Margaret said. "He's not that kind of man. He just asked." Evelyn thought about that. She thought about a man who took notes instead of talking, who saw the reinforced panel in a riding skirt and recognized what it meant, who had written good with no embellishment and meant it as the whole thing. "He's going to come back to the shop," she said. "Probably," Margaret agreed. "He usually needs something by November, heavier work clothes for the winter hands." "Not for that," Evelyn said. Margaret's needle paused. She looked over the top of her glasses. "No," she said. "I don't expect that's why." He came back on a gray October morning when the wind was coming in hard from the north and the main street was nearly empty. He brought the notebook, as always, and he brought something else. A length of fabric he'd apparently picked up at the general store, a medium-weight canvas, and he laid it on the counter and wrote, "I don't know if this is what I need. Trying to make dividers for the storage room in the north barn. Thought you might know if it would hold up." She examined the canvas. She examined the weight and the weave, and then she wrote, "It'll work. You might want something waxed if moisture is an issue." Is the barn insulated? They were deep into a conversation about barn construction and storage logistics, before either of them apparently noticed that this was not a conversation about sewing at all. She noticed it when she looked up from writing about optimal ways to seal canvas edges, and found him watching her with an expression she recognized, because she'd started feeling something similar. He wrote, "I should probably tell you that I've never talked this much to anyone in a single sitting." She wrote, "We haven't talked at all." He looked at that for a moment, and then he smiled. Not a performance of a smile, a real one, the kind that takes over the face before the owner decides whether they intended it. She felt something in her chest shift in a way she hadn't expected and hadn't asked for, and absolutely did not know what to do with. She wrote, "Can I ask you something?" He wrote, "Yes." She wrote, "When I first came in, you didn't react to my voice. Was it because you couldn't hear it?" He read that slowly. He wrote, "I heard something, vibration or pressure, when people are close. I knew you spoke. I just couldn't make out what you said." He paused, pencil on the page. Then he kept writing. "But that's not why I didn't react. I don't react to voices. I don't have the instinct to make a quick judgment about a person from how they sound." She read that twice. She wrote, "That must be restful." He looked at what she'd written and laughed. Not loud, the quietest kind of laugh, breath through the nose, the kind that catches a person by surprise. She thought, oh. She thought, here is someone who understands something about being in a body that the world misreads. Not in the same way, not with the same particulars, but the shape of it. She wrote, "I was very talkative before I was sick." He wrote, "What kind of sick?" She wrote, "Fever, throat, 3 years ago. It changed my voice." Shh, she paused. "People hear it and decide they already know something about me." He read that. He was quiet for a moment, which with him was different from the silence of people who didn't know what to say. Because his silence was always a thinking silence. You could almost see it working. He wrote, "People see me and decide they already know something about me." She wrote, "I know." He wrote, "Do you? You haven't made any visible assumptions." She wrote, "You seemed like someone who knew what he wanted and was methodical about getting it. That was my assumption." He wrote, "That's accurate." She wrote, "I know." He looked at her. She looked at him. Outside, the wind came in from the north, and the gray sky pressed down on Cedar Ridge with the particular winter-is-coming weight of Wyoming in October, and neither of them wrote anything else for a minute. Then he wrote, "I'd like to come back. Not for fabric." She picked up the chalk. She wrote, "All right." He put his hat on. He put his notebook in his pocket. He picked up the canvas, which he appeared to have forgotten about entirely. At the door he stopped and turned back, and he raised one hand. Not a wave exactly, something more deliberate. And she raised hers, and then he went out into the wind. She stood at the counter with the chalk in her hand. Margaret appeared in the doorway to the back room with her arms folded and her glasses pushed up onto her forehead. "Don't say anything," Evelyn said. "I wasn't going to say a word," Margaret said, and went back to her work. He came back on a Tuesday. Evelyn knew he would. He had said so, and she had already developed a sense that Silas Bennett was not a man who said things he didn't mean, partly because saying things cost him more effort than it cost most people, and he didn't spend that effort carelessly. But knowing he would come back and being prepared for it turned out to be different problems, and she was in the middle of a particularly stubborn sleeve seam when the bell over the door rang and she looked up and there he was, snow on his coat shoulders, notebook already in his hand. She set down the sleeve. He looked around the shop for a moment the way he always did when he first came in. She'd noticed this, the way he took stock of a space when he entered it, a quick inventory of who was where and what had changed. Margaret was in the back. The shop was otherwise empty. He looked at Evelyn and raised his eyebrows in the particular way that she was beginning to understand meant, "How are you without the notebook?" She held up one hand and tilted it side to side. So. He wrote, "The sleeve?" She looked at the sleeve. She looked at him. She wrote, "How did you know?" He wrote, "You were holding your jaw tight when I came in. You do that when something's frustrating you." She hadn't known she did that. She wrote, "You've been paying attention." He wrote, "Yes." That was all he wrote. Just yes, plain and unashamed about it, and she felt the back of her neck go warm in a way that had nothing to do with the stove. She turned back to the sleeve and he sat down on the chair beside the cutting table. He'd started doing this, claiming that chair like it was simply the place he sat when he was here, and opened his notebook to a fresh page. She wasn't sure if he was going to write something or just be there, and she found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she didn't mind either. He stayed for 2 hours that day. They wrote rather, about things that had no particular urgency. He asked about Philadelphia, what it actually looked like, and she tried to describe it with chalk on the small board because the notebook was his, and she felt strange borrowing it, though he'd offered twice. She described the row houses and the way the street smelled after rain and the particular light off the river in late afternoon, and he read it all with the attention of someone to whom geography was interesting rather than decorative. She asked about the ranch. He had 400 head of cattle, 30 horses, and 11 people working for him year-round. He'd inherited the land from his father, but the operation had been half what it was now when he took it over at 26. He described the north pasture where he was putting in new fencing before winter, the drainage problem in the lower field that had taken him 3 years to solve, the particular stubbornness of a horse named Fletcher, who was the best cutting horse he'd ever owned and also the most difficult animal alive. He wrote, "My foreman Ray thinks Fletcher does it on purpose, makes things difficult just to see what you'll do." She wrote, "What do you do?" He wrote, "Wait him out. He always comes around eventually. He just needs to feel like it was his idea." She wrote, "That's a very patient approach." He wrote, "I've had practice." She understood, without him saying more, that he wasn't talking about the horse. The thing about Cedar Ridge was that it watched. Small towns always did, she supposed. She hadn't spent enough time in them before to know whether Cedar Ridge was more watchful than average, or whether this was simply the nature of places where everyone knew the dimensions of everyone else's life. But Cedar Ridge watched with a particular intensity, possibly because the arrival of an unwanted mail-order bride was the most interesting thing to happen since the spring flooding of 2 years prior. People had opinions about Evelyn. She heard some of them directly. Women who came into the shop for alterations who were friendly in the particular way that means they're gathering information, and she heard the rest through Margaret, who had no patience for gossip, but an accurate sense of its contents. The opinions mostly concerned Harold. Some people thought Harold had been within his rights. A man asked for a certain kind of wife and received something else. Wasn't that a legitimate grievance? Others thought he'd handled it badly, but couldn't quite manage to say he'd handled it wrong. A smaller group, mostly women, mostly older, thought he was a fool and said so, but quietly, in the way people say true things in places where the man in question owns the building their husband works in. Nobody had strong opinions about Evelyn herself. She was too new, too quiet, too recent to have accumulated the material that opinions require. What they had opinions about, increasingly, was Silas Bennett coming to the dressmaker's shop twice a week. She heard it first from a woman named Clara Hutchins, who came in for a blouse alteration in early November and managed to spend 45 minutes on a 20-minute job through the simple mechanism of talking without pause. "People are wondering," Clara said, turning slowly on the fitting block while Evelyn pinned the side seam, "about Mr. Bennett's visits. Not that anyone thinks, it's none of anyone's business, of course, but people do wonder." Evelyn pinned the seam and said nothing. "He's a very private man," Clara continued. "Always has been. He doesn't come into town much, and when he does, he's purposeful about it. Comes in, does what he needs, goes back out. So naturally people notice when he changes his habits." She craned her neck to look at the side seam in the mirror. "Is that too tight?" Evelyn shook her head. "Of course, he's perfectly entitled to visit any shop he likes," Clara said. "And you're entitled to have customers. Nobody's saying anything untoward. It's just, you're both in somewhat unusual situations, aren't you? The way people see you, and people talk." Evelyn stood up and wrote on the small board she'd started keeping pinned to her apron. "Is there anything specific you'd like me to tell you?" Clara read it. Clara's expression cycled through surprise, and then something that was either embarrassment or annoyance, and then settled on a kind of wounded dignity. "I'm not asking for gossip," she said. "I'm just being friendly." Evelyn underlined the question on the board and looked at her. Clara got down from the fitting block and said she'd come back Thursday for the blouse. She told Silas about it the next time he came, writing it out in the slightly clipped way she'd developed for things she found irritating, where the sentences got shorter and the punctuation more emphatic. He read it. He wrote, "Clara Hutchins has been talking about my business since I was 22. She once told 3 people I was going to sell the ranch and move to Denver. I have never been to Denver, she wrote. Does it bother you? He considered this longer than she expected. He wrote, It used to. When I was young, I spent a lot of energy being angry about what people said, about my limitations, about what they thought I couldn't do. He stopped writing for a moment, tapping the pencil against the edge of the notebook. Then he kept going. At some point, I decided the energy cost was too high. They were going to talk regardless. What mattered was whether what they said bore any resemblance to reality. She wrote, And when it does? He wrote, Then I've given them something true to talk about. That's on me. But this, he gestured between them, meaning the shop, meaning the visits, meaning whatever this was becoming. This isn't their business. She wrote, Harold thinks it is. His expression shifted. Not dramatically. Silas's face didn't do dramatic shifts. It did precise small ones, but she could see it. He wrote, What has Harold done? It wasn't quite a question. The lack of question mark was interesting. She wrote, Nothing direct. But I hear things. He's been saying we're a pair of unfortunates who found each other. That it's, he used the word fitting. Silas read that word. His jaw tightened in a way that reminded her, uncomfortably, of how her own jaw tightened when she was working on something frustrating. He wrote, Harold Whitmore has been trying to make himself feel large by making other people feel small since before I came to this territory. He's good at finding the thing that costs a person the most and pressing on it. She wrote, What does he press on with you? He wrote, My independence. He suggested once, when I was younger, that the county should look into having someone appointed to oversee the Rocking Bees operations. For my protection, he said. Because how could a man who couldn't hear properly manage a complex business? She stared at that. She wrote, What happened? He wrote, I had a better year than any other ranch in the county and made sure the figures were available to anyone who wanted to look at them. The best answer to Harold is usually just to keep going. She thought about that. She thought about what it took to be 20-something and deaf in Wyoming territory and decide the answer to someone trying to take away your autonomy was simply to keep building. She wrote, I think I'm angrier on your behalf than you are. He wrote, I had 14 years to process it. You're just hearing it now. She wrote, That's reasonable? He wrote, Yes. Then he wrote, Are you angry on your own behalf? She stopped. The honest answer was complicated. She was angry, had been angry since the train platform, but the anger had layers to it that were hard to separate out. There was the anger at Harold, clean and clear. There was the anger at herself for being surprised, which was its own particular flavor of terrible. And underneath those was something older and harder that had nothing to do with Harold or Cedar Ridge. The anger she'd been carrying since the fever, at the body that had betrayed her, at the world that had decided one alteration to her voice was grounds to revise its entire assessment of her. She wrote, Yes. But it's not simple anger. He wrote, It rarely is. She wrote, You know what the worst part is? It's not that Harold rejected me. I didn't love him. I barely knew him. It's that he did it in front of everyone, and he did it in a way that was supposed to make me feel like I should agree with his assessment. He read that slowly. He wrote, Did it work? She thought about standing on that platform with her trunk. She thought about the moment she decided not to get back on the train. She wrote, No. He wrote, Good. There it was again, that word, that same plain word, and it landed the same way it had the first time, like being handed something solid in the middle of a current. The riding skirt had been the beginning, but it wasn't the only thing. In November, a woman named Dot Hennessy came into the shop asking about a code alteration and mentioned in passing that she worked out at the Rocking Bee, cook and general housekeeper, had been there 11 years. She was perhaps 50, with the coloring of someone who'd spent decades working near heat and the manner of a person who found most things at least somewhat amusing. Silas mentioned the shop, Dot said, with perfect neutrality, while Evelyn assessed the coat's lining. Said the work was good. Evelyn wrote, I'm glad. He doesn't mention shops, Dot said. Generally speaking, he mentions things that need doing, the weather, and occasionally the cattle market. He doesn't mention shops. Evelyn kept her eyes on the coat lining. He also, Dot said, has started keeping better hours. Used to stay out in that north pasture till it was fully dark. Been coming in earlier. I don't know why. I'm not asking. She looked at the mirror with her coat on and turned slightly. Is the lining supposed to pull like that? Evelyn shook her head and got back to work. But she thought about it, the north pasture, the earlier hours. And she felt something she hadn't felt in quite a long time. Something cautious and uncertain and warm, like a fire you're not sure yet is going to hold. Harold came into the shop for the second time on a Thursday in mid-November, and this time he didn't bother with the pretense of a gift. Margaret was there this time, which Evelyn suspected Harold hadn't accounted for, and the two of them regarded each other with the particular wariness of people who have had dealings in the past and remember all of them. I wanted to speak to Miss Hartwell, Harold said. He was dressed well, as always. He had the appearance of a man who understood that looking successful was half of being believed to be successful. She's working, Margaret said. It won't take long. She's working, Margaret said again, in exactly the same tone. Harold looked at Evelyn. Evelyn looked back at him. She had a half-finished bodice in her hands, and she didn't put it down. I've heard about the Bennett visits, Harold said, and his voice had the careful texture of someone trying to sound concerned rather than irritated, and not quite managing it. I think you should know that people are talking in a way that doesn't reflect well on you. She picked up her chalk. She wrote, On me specifically? On the situation, Harold said, on the impression it creates. A woman in your position can't afford to be careless with her reputation. She wrote, What position is that? Harold's mouth tightened. You came here to marry. That didn't work out through no fault of... The arrangement didn't suit. Sweet, you're working in a shop. You're building something, which I admire. But a woman who's already given people reason to question her judgment. She wrote, You gave people reason to question my character. There's a difference. Harold stopped. Margaret, from the back of the shop, said nothing, which was its own kind of statement. I'm trying to help you, Harold said. She wrote, I know what you're trying to do. He looked at what she'd written for a long moment. Then he looked at her. Something moved across his face that wasn't quite anger. It was more specific than anger, more personal. She was beginning to understand that Harold's problem wasn't really about her at all. It was about a particular version of himself he'd built and was trying to maintain, a version in which he was the most capable, the most reasonable, the most necessary person in any situation he occupied. She complicated that version. So did Silas. They complicated it by existing without his help. I hope you know what you're doing, Harold said. She wrote, I do. He left. Margaret came out from the back room and sat on her stool and picked up her sewing. He'll escalate, Margaret said. He always does when he doesn't get the thing he wanted. I know, Evelyn said. Are you worried? Evelyn thought about it honestly. A little, she said. Not about him, about what he can do. Margaret was quiet for a moment. He owns the building the land office is in, she said. He's on the town council. He's friends with Judge Mercer, who is either corrupt or stupid, and possibly both. She pushed her needle through the cloth. He's not powerless. No, Evelyn said. But neither is Silas Bennett, Margaret said, and I don't think he is either. Evelyn looked at her. I've been watching Silas come in here twice a week for 6 weeks, Margaret said. That man is not someone who makes casual investments. She said it the way she said most things, plainly, practically, as information rather than commentary, and then she went back to her sewing and didn't say anything else about it. The first time Evelyn went out to the Rocking Bee was Silas's idea, technically, though he'd proposed it so carefully in writing that it had several exit points built in, the way a man proposes something to someone he doesn't want to pressure. He wrote, Ray's wife wants to see the skirt fitted. She lives on the property. If you're willing to make a house call, I could come get you in the wagon. No obligation. I can also bring her into town. She wrote, I'll come out. He wrote, Saturday? She wrote, Saturday. He picked her up at 8 in the morning, the wagon loaded with a tarp against the possibility of snow, which did not materialize but was considerate. The drive out was 45 minutes across country that was beautiful in the bleak way of Wyoming in late November, the grasses gone gold and flat, the sky the particular pale blue of cold air and thin cloud. They didn't write much on the drive. There wasn't a good surface for it. Instead, they sat beside each other on the wagon bench with the cold coming off the land, and she found that this, too, was a kind of conversation. The being together without needing to fill it, which she hadn't had with many people, and which felt, each time, like something she hadn't known she'd been missing. The ranch was larger than she'd imagined. Not the acreage, she'd known the figures, but the sense of it, the way it was arranged, the order in it. It wasn't tidy in the way of things that are kept for show. It was functional in the way of things that have been thought through, where every building was where it was for a reason, and the reasons were good ones. Ray's wife, whose name was Nora, was a broad-shouldered woman of about 35 who looked at the riding skirt and immediately put it on and walked around the kitchen in it and declared it the best-fitting garment she'd owned since the skirt her mother made her in 1878. "It doesn't bind anywhere," she said, with the wonder of someone for whom binding was an accepted feature of clothing. Evelyn wrote, "I reinforced the inner panel. Let me know if the seam placement is right once you've ridden in it." "You're already thinking about the next problem," Nora said, which seemed to strike her as a significant observation. Silas watched from across the room with the expression of a man who had arranged something and was satisfied with how it was going, and Evelyn noticed this and chose not to react to it, which was harder than it should have been. But the snow came the following week, first a light dusting, and then, over 3 days, the serious kind that settled in and announced its intention to stay. Cedar Ridge pulled inward the way it did each winter, the streets quieter, the social world contracted to the distance people were willing to walk in the cold. Silas still came to the shop. This was notable, Evelyn understood, not because of what it meant about her, but because of what it meant about him. 8 miles in a Wyoming winter was not nothing. It was a decision made repeatedly, each time with the clear understanding of what it cost. He came in on a Wednesday in late November with snow on his hat and what appeared to be a fresh cut across his left hand, wrapped in a cloth that had not started its life as a bandage. She pointed at the hand. He wrote, "Wire fence. The new stuff is vicious." She went to the back and found the small medical kit Margaret kept for work injuries and came back and unwrapped the cloth and looked at the cut. It wasn't deep enough for concern, but it was long and it had been wrapped incorrectly, the pressure in the wrong place. She rewrapped it. He sat still and let her, which she noticed. He didn't flinch or pull away or make any of the movements of a man performing stoicism. He just sat there and watched her hands. When she was done, she wrote, "You should have done this before you drove 8 miles. He wrote, "Probably." She wrote, "Ray couldn't have wrapped it?" He wrote, "I wanted to come anyway." She looked at him. He looked back at her. She had known, she supposed, for some time. Known it in the way you know something when you've been careful not to look directly at it, but it's been in your peripheral vision long enough that the shape of it is familiar. Sitting beside him on the wagon bench in the November cold. The notebook passing back and forth across the counter. The plain word good. The way he'd read her description of Philadelphia like a person receiving something they actually wanted. She wrote, "This is probably not sensible." He wrote, "No." She wrote, "People are already talking." He wrote, "I know." She wrote, "Harold is going to make things difficult." He wrote, "Yes." And then, "Are any of those reasons you want to stop?" She looked at the question for a long time. She thought about the train platform and the decision not to get back on the train, and all the smaller decisions that had come after it, each one made in the same direction, toward staying, toward building, toward the version of herself that had walked up the main street of Cedar Ridge with her arms aching from the trunk and her jaw set. She wrote, "No." He wrote, "Good." Outside, the snow came down on Cedar Ridge with the indifference of weather that doesn't care what it interrupts. And inside the shop, the stove ticked against the cold, and Margaret's needle moved through her work in the back room, and Evelyn Hartwell sat across a counter from Silas Bennett and felt, for the first time since the fever had rearranged her life, that she was exactly where she had decided to be. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, quite a great deal. The winter settled into Cedar Ridge the way it always did. Not all at once, but by degrees. Each cold morning a little colder than the last. The light going thin and early, the town pulling its collective collar up and getting on with things. December came in hard and stayed that way. Evelyn had moved out of the back room at Margaret's shop by then. The back room had served its purpose. It had kept her off the street in November when $11 was the difference between a plan and a disaster. But it was not a place a person could live indefinitely without losing something essential about themselves. She'd found 2 rooms above the harness makers on the east side of town. Nothing remarkable. Low ceilings and a window that let in cold air at the left corner. no matter what she did to the frame, but they were hers. She bought a secondhand quilt from a woman moving to California. She hung her mother's scissors on a nail above the work table she set up near the window with the better light. Small things. But the accumulation of small things is how a life gets built, and she was building. Margaret had given her a small raise in December. Not large, not enough to change the arithmetic of her situation dramatically, but enough that the arithmetic was no longer frightening every morning when she woke up. She'd taken on 3 private alterations that month beyond the shop work, word having spread in the quiet, sideways manner of small towns that the Eastern woman at Doyle's was the one to see if you wanted a garment that actually fit the body wearing it. A rancher's wife from 12 miles out had brought her a dress for a Christmas gathering that had been made by a dressmaker in Cheyenne and fit in the shoulders but was calamitous through the waist. Evelyn had taken it apart and put it back together in 4 hours. The woman had cried a little, which Evelyn took as the best professional review she'd ever received. Silas had come to the shop 11 times in December, which meant roughly 3 times a week, which meant he was driving 8 miles each way in Wyoming winter weather more often than was strictly necessary for any purpose Margaret's shop could legitimately serve. Nobody in Cedar Ridge lacked the arithmetic to understand what this meant. They discussed it accordingly. Harold Whitmore had spent December watching and saying nothing, which Evelyn found more unnerving than his 2 previous visits combined. She knew he was watching. She could feel it the way you feel weather coming. Not seeing it yet, just a particular quality to the air that tells you something is building. He was on the town council, and the council met twice a month in the back room of the land office, and she heard from Margaret, who heard from Alma at the hotel, that Harold had brought up the subject of public standards and community propriety at the December meeting in terms vague enough to be deniable, but pointed enough to be clear. He didn't name names, Margaret reported, setting down her cup of coffee with the particular deliberateness of someone choosing words. But he talked about the example the town sets. Whether Cedar Ridge is the kind of place that holds itself to a certain standard. Whether certain situations give outsiders a poor impression of the community. Evelyn wrote, "He means us." "He means you," Margaret said. "Silas he can't touch directly. Silas has been here his whole life and owns more productive land than anyone in the county. But you're new. You came to marry Harold and didn't. That's the thread he's going to pull." She wrote, "What can he actually do?" Margaret was quiet for a moment. She was a woman who thought before she spoke, which Evelyn had come to appreciate as a fairly rare quality. "He can shape how people see you," Margaret said finally. "And in a town this size, how people see you determines what's available to you. Whether women bring their sewing here or go to the dressmaker in Rawlins instead. Whether the council decides to look into, various things. Licensing. The propriety of a woman running a private business out of rooms above a harness maker's." She paused. "None of it rises to the level of anything you could fight in a courtroom. It's all just pressure." Evelyn had sat with that for the rest of the day, turning it over. She understood pressure. She had been under it since the fever, had been under it since the train platform, had been under it every time someone leaned in to hear her speak and then recalibrated their expectations of her on the spot. The question was never whether pressure would come. The question was always what you were made of when it did. The new year came in with a blizzard that kept everyone indoors for 4 days and then blew itself out and left Cedar Ridge looking clean and impossibly white under a sky so blue it seemed like an overcorrection. Silas couldn't get the wagon through for nearly 2 weeks, which Evelyn only knew mattered to her when the 2 weeks were over and she looked up from her work one morning and found him coming through the door with snow on his coat and his notebook already in his hand, and felt something in her chest release that she hadn't realized had been holding tight. He looked at her. He raised his eyebrows. She held up both hands. "Fine, fine." Then, because she was not a person who lied well even in pantomime, she tilted one hand side to side. He sat down and wrote, "Roads were bad." She wrote, "I know." He wrote, "Were you managing?" She wrote, "Yes." "Margaret let me take more work home. I finished 4 pieces." He wrote, "I wasn't asking about the work." She looked at him. "I was fine," she said out loud, which came out in its usual whispered roughness. She'd been doing that more lately, speaking rather than writing, around him specifically. He couldn't hear her, so there was no one to flinch. It was, she'd discovered, a relief she hadn't known she'd been needing. He watched her mouth when she spoke. He was good at lip reading, better than he'd implied, though she'd gathered from various things he'd written that he found it unreliable for anything important because the gaps were too large. But he could read the shape of short sentences. He wrote, "I could tell." She wrote, "Could you?" He wrote, "You look different when you've been alone too long. You get very careful, like you're conserving something." She didn't know what to do with that level of accuracy, so she wrote, "That's uncomfortably observant." He wrote, "You do the same thing to me. You notice when I'm frustrated before I've done anything to show it." She wrote, "You get very still." He wrote, "Most people don't notice that." She wrote, "Most people aren't paying attention." He looked at that. Then he wrote, "No, they're not." It was Ray who told Silas what Harold had been doing, which was how Silas knew before Evelyn had fully understood the scope of it. Ray was a direct man who communicated in the efficient way of people who have worked with someone long enough that most of the contextual scaffolding has been removed. He came into the bunkhouse one evening in mid-January while Silas was going over the account books and put a piece of paper on the desk. Silas read it. Ray had written, "Harold Whitmore has been talking to the Grange members, saying you've lost your judgment, that you're spending time in town on personal business when the ranch needs your attention. Jensen repeated it to me at the feed store. Thought you should know." Silas had put the paper down and looked at the accounts for a while. He wrote back to Ray, "Is Jensen's opinion changeable?" Ray wrote, "If the spring yields are good, yes." Silas wrote, "Then we make sure the spring yields are good. And then, what else is Harold saying?" Ray wrote, "That the Hartwell woman is a distraction, that you're not thinking clearly." Silas had sat with that for the rest of the evening, long after Ray had gone, the lamp burning down while he looked at the window and thought about what Harold Whitmore understood about thinking clearly. He drove to Cedar Ridge 2 days later and told Evelyn about it directly, the way he told her most things. Not softened, not padded with reassurance, just the fact of it laid out so she could look at it from the same angle he was. She read what he'd written. She wrote, "He's coming at you through the Grange because he can't touch you directly." He wrote, "Yes." She wrote, "And he's using me as the reason your judgment is compromised." He wrote, "He's trying to." She wrote, "Is it working?" He wrote, "With some of them, probably. The ones who already had reservations about me. There are always men who've been waiting for evidence that their doubts were right." She wrote, "What do we do?" She noticed she'd written "we" and so did he. She could tell by the way he paused before responding, something settling in his expression. He wrote, "I keep running the ranch the way I've always run it. You keep building what you're building. Harold needs us to react badly. He needs me to either withdraw from town to prove I'm focused on business or keep coming to town so he can keep saying I'm distracted. Either way, he wants us responding to him." She wrote, "So we don't." He wrote, "We don't." She wrote, "That's very calm for a man whose reputation is being picked at." He wrote, "I've had practice at this too." And then, after a moment, "Are you scared?" She thought about the honest answer, which was different from the answer she would have given a few months ago. She wrote, "A little. Not of Harold. Of what he can do to the things I'm building here. I've been building very carefully." He wrote, "I know." She wrote, "I don't want to lose it." He wrote, "You won't." She wrote, "You can't promise that." He considered this. Then he wrote, "No. But I can tell you I won't let him have it without a fight. And I'm not an easy person to beat in a sustained conflict." She looked at him. She thought of the deaf man at 26 who'd taken a half-functioning ranch and built it into the most productive operation in the county. She thought of him driving 8 miles in a Wyoming winter, repeatedly, because he'd decided to. She wrote, "No, I don't suppose you are." February brought a thaw, and then a refreeze, and then a week of weather so brutal that even the most determined social lives in Cedar Ridge contracted to the minimum. But in that contraction, Harold Whitmore managed to escalate in a way nobody had quite anticipated, possibly because it was so brazen that people who were used to his subtler methods didn't recognize it for what it was until it had already happened. He held a meeting. He called it a community discussion about Cedar Ridge's future development, which was the kind of language that made people feel they ought to attend so as not to miss something important. The meeting was held in the main room of the Grange Hall on a Thursday evening in the second week of February. About 30 people came, which was a respectable turnout for a February Thursday in a town where the wind chill had been brutal for 5 consecutive days. Margaret had heard about it from Alma, who had heard about it from the council secretary, who mentioned it in passing as though it were routine. Margaret told Evelyn on Wednesday morning. Evelyn wrote, "Are we meant to know about it?" "We're not meant to attend," Margaret said. "Whether we're meant to know about it is a different question." Evelyn wrote, "Will Silas know?" "Probably. Ray hears most things." She wrote to Silas through Dot, who made a weekly town run for ranch supplies. She had no other reliable method of reaching him quickly, and she was aware that the reliance on Dot was its own kind of legible message to anyone watching, but there wasn't a better option. She wrote simply, "Harold is holding a community meeting Thursday. I don't know what he's planning. Thought you should know." Dot brought back a note in Silas's handwriting. "I know. Ray told me. I'll be there." She wrote back, "So will I." Dot looked at that note before she folded it, which Evelyn noticed and decided not to comment on. The Grange Hall smelled of wood smoke and wet wool and the close warmth of too many people in a space designed for slightly fewer. Evelyn arrived with Margaret, who had decided to attend on the grounds that she had been a resident of Cedar Ridge for 19 years, and the town council had not yet revoked her right to be present at community discussions. Silas was already there when they arrived, standing near the side wall with Ray beside him. He saw her come in. He raised his chin slightly in acknowledgement. She did the same. Harold was at the front of the room with the particular energy of a man who has arranged something to his advantage and is enjoying the anticipation of it. He greeted people as they came in with the practiced warmth of someone who had spent years making people feel that he was on their side generally, so that when he positioned himself against someone specifically, it felt to the audience like a reasonable man driven reluctantly to a conclusion. The meeting started with genuine housekeeping, road maintenance on the northern approach, a question about the spring water rights, something about a fence line dispute near the eastern boundary that involved 2 families and had been ongoing since 1883. Evelyn sat through all of it with her hands folded and watched Harold. He was patient. That was the thing about Harold that you had to respect in order to protect yourself from. He was patient in the way that patient people who are also calculating can be, which is a specific and dangerous combination. He waited until the genuine business was done and the room had the relaxed quality of people about to leave before he said he had one more item. "I've been thinking," Harold said, "about what kind of community we want Cedar Ridge to be." The room resettled. This was the kind of sentence that made people stay. He spoke for about 10 minutes. He was good at speaking, clear, unhurried, with the measured cadence of a man who had thought things through and arrived at reluctant conclusions. He talked about the growth of the territory and what Cedar Ridge needed to do to attract the right kind of settler and the right kind of investment. He talked about the standards that families expected when they were choosing where to build a life. He talked about the importance of the town presenting a certain image, prosperous, orderly, morally coherent. He didn't name anyone. He didn't have to. The people in the room understood what he was talking about. Evelyn could see it in the way certain faces shifted. Not everyone. Not even most, but enough. The slight movement of eyes toward her and then toward Silas, the careful, neutral expressions of people who had decided to see which way things fell before committing. "What I'm proposing," Harold said, arriving finally at the thing he'd been building toward, "is a committee, a welfare committee, if you will, to help ensure that all members of our community are properly situated and properly supported, that people who need assistance are getting it." He paused. "We have some members of our community who face particular challenges, who might benefit from additional structure and support. I think Cedar Ridge can be the kind of place that provides that." Evelyn felt Margaret go still beside her. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Silas stood up. He walked to the front of the room with the particular deliberateness of a man who had thought about every step before he took it, which was how Silas moved through most things. He picked up the piece of chalk that Harold kept beside the Grange's small announcement board and wrote on the board in large, clear letters, "Who, specifically, needs this committee's help?" He turned and looked at Harold. Harold looked at the board. Harold looked at Silas. Harold's expression underwent a brief recalibration, something between irritation and the performance of patience. "I'm speaking generally," Harold said, "about the town's capacity to support." Silas erased the board and wrote, "Name the people you're referring to." The room had gone very still in the way that rooms go still when something real is happening. Harold said, I don't think naming individuals is, Silas wrote, you've spent 20 minutes implying. Either say what you mean or don't take up the town's time. Someone in the room laughed, quickly, before catching themselves. Evelyn couldn't see who. Harold's face had gone the particular color it went when things weren't proceeding as he'd arranged them. Mr. Bennett, he said, with the careful courtesy of a man choosing his words in public, I have the highest respect for your accomplishments. I think most people in this room do. But there are certain practical realities about running a complex enterprise that, Silas wrote on the board, the Rocking Bee turned a profit in every one of the last 14 years. The county records are public. Anyone who wants to examine my management of a complex enterprise is welcome to do so. He underlined public. That's not what I meant, Silas wrote. Then say what you mean. The silence this time was longer. Evelyn had been sitting very still, watching. She could feel the room's attention moving between Harold and Silas like weather looking for somewhere to land. She could see Harold calculating. He was always calculating. It was the most consistent thing about him, weighing what he'd lose by pressing forward against what he'd lose by backing down. He chose a third option, which was to redirect. Miss Hartwell, Harold said, turning toward her with an expression so practiced in its concern that it was almost admirable. You've built something admirable here in Cedar Ridge, given the circumstances. And I think people respect that, but I do wonder whether you've considered the longer view, whether this situation is truly in your best interests. A woman alone in a new town, making certain... She stood up. She hadn't planned to. Her body made the decision before her mind finished forming it. She stood up and walked to the front of the room, and Harold, to his credit or his surprise, stopped talking. She picked up the chalk. She thought for a moment about what she wanted to say. There was a great deal she could write. There was the long version and the short version, and the version that laid out every specific grievance with documentation, and the version that was simply the truth stated plainly. She wrote, I came to Cedar Ridge to build a life. I'm building one. I don't require a committee. She stepped back. She looked at the room. Most of them were looking at her. Some of them had the expression of people seeing something they hadn't expected. Not the words, which were simple enough, but her. The woman from the train platform, standing at the front of the Grange Hall with chalk in her hand and no apparent intention of sitting back down until she was ready. Harold said, Miss Hartwell, I understand this feels. She wrote, Mr. Whitmore, you rejected me in public. You did it loudly, in front of this town, to protect your own image. I didn't fight you then because I was new here, and I was in shock and I needed time to understand what I was dealing with. She paused, turned to look at him directly. Then she kept writing. I've had time now. If you'd like to have a genuine conversation about the welfare of this community, I'll be at Margaret Doyle's shop tomorrow morning. But this, she gestured at the room, at the meeting, at all of it, is not a conversation. It's a performance, and I don't have any use for it. She set the chalk down. The room was very quiet. Silas was watching her from the side wall. He had an expression she'd never seen on his face before, something careful and specific, that took her a moment to identify, because it was not an expression she received often. It was pride. Not the possessive kind, not the kind that means mine, the real kind, the kind that means look at this person, look at what they're made of. She walked back to her seat. Margaret didn't say anything. Margaret didn't need to. Harold stood at the front of the room and said a few more things that no one afterward could quite remember, and the meeting ended without a committee being formed or a vote being taken or any resolution of any kind, which was its own kind of resolution. People left the Grange Hall in clusters, the way they always did after something interesting. Closer together, voices low, the particular energy of people processing a shared experience and needing to compare notes. Evelyn let them go. She sat for a moment while the hall emptied and felt the adrenaline of what she'd done moving through her system like cold water. She hadn't planned it. That was the part that unsettled her most. Not what she'd said, but the impulsiveness of it, the way she'd stood up before she knew she was going to. She was generally a person who thought before she acted. 3 years of having to choose words carefully had made her deliberate in most things. Tonight she had been the opposite of deliberate, and she was still deciding how she felt about that. Silas sat down beside her. The hall was nearly empty now. A couple of older men near the door were putting on their coats. Harold had left without speaking to either of them, which she took as its own kind of statement. Silas wrote in his notebook and pushed it toward her. Are you all right? She wrote, I don't know yet. He wrote, that was... He stopped. He crossed out whatever he'd been writing. He wrote instead, what you said was true, and it needed saying. She wrote, it was impulsive. He wrote, yes. She wrote, I don't usually act impulsively. He wrote, I know. That's why it landed the way it did. She thought about that. She wrote, did it land well? Truly? He wrote, I watched 6 different people in this room change their expression when you stood up. There's a difference between people who are sympathetic to you and people who respect you. Tonight, some of them moved from one to the other. She wrote, and Harold? He wrote, Harold is embarrassed. That's more dangerous than Harold being angry in the short term. But it also means he showed his hand tonight and didn't get what he came for. That's a cost to him. She wrote, he'll try again. He wrote, yes. She wrote, we should be ready. He looked at what she'd written. The we again, the same word she'd used before. And this time she didn't look away from it, and neither did he. He wrote, yes, we should. Margaret appeared at the end of the row, with her coat buttoned and her expression, the calm, measuring look she wore when she'd been watching something carefully. Ready? She said to Evelyn. Evelyn stood. She picked up her coat. Silas stood too. He looked at Evelyn. He held out his hand. Not the injured one, the other one, steady and open, in the middle of the nearly empty Grange Hall in Cedar Ridge, Wyoming, in February 1888, with Margaret Doyle watching and the wind coming hard against the windows. She took it. It lasted perhaps 4 seconds, that handshake, that hold, firm and plain and not ambiguous about what it meant. Then he put his hat on and walked out into the cold, and she watched him go, and she thought about what it meant to build a life in a place that had tried to turn you away. You built it anyway. You built it exactly there, in that place, with those specific materials, and you made it strong enough that the people who'd said you couldn't were eventually forced to look at it every single day. She walked out into the February dark with Margaret beside her, and the stars over Cedar Ridge were very bright, and the cold was very serious, and she was not afraid. The morning after the Grange meeting, Cedar Ridge had the particular quality of a town that had witnessed something and was still deciding what it thought about what it had witnessed. Evelyn felt it when she walked to the shop. People looked at her differently. Not all of them, not dramatically, but in the small calibrations that you learn to read when you've spent years paying attention to how people receive you. A woman who had previously managed a pleasant nod while looking slightly past her actually stopped and said good morning and meant it. The man who ran the feed store, who had always been politely indifferent, held the door of the general store open for her with something that resembled respect. Small things. The kind of things that don't add up to much individually but collectively suggest a shift in the weather. Margaret noticed it too. She said nothing about it directly, which was her way of saying she'd noticed. Harold, by all accounts, had gone home from the Grange meeting and not been seen since, which was unusual for a man who made a point of being visible. Evelyn worked through the morning on a coat order that needed to be done by Friday and tried not to spend too much time thinking about what came next. The problem with having made a public statement was that the statement required a next thing, some action that proved it hadn't been empty. She had stood in the Grange Hall and told 30 people that she was building a life and didn't need their committee. Now she had to keep building it in a way that was visible, that had shape and weight, that wasn't just words written on a chalkboard. She was thinking about this when the letter arrived. It came in the mid-morning post, brought by the boy from the depot who handled deliveries on this end of town. He handed it to Margaret, who brought it back to where Evelyn was working at the cutting table and set it down beside her without comment. The return address was a law firm in Philadelphia. Evelyn looked at it for a moment before she picked it up. Her brother's name wasn't on it, which meant it wasn't from her brother, which narrowed the field considerably. She had no remaining connections to Philadelphia that she could think of that would involve a law firm. Her parents had both been dead for 7 years. Her aunt, the aunt who had the sewing shop, the one who had taught her to cut on the bias and to recognize good wool by the weight of it, had died the previous winter. She opened the letter. She read it once, quickly, the way you read something you don't quite believe. Then she read it again slowly. Margaret had gone back to her work and was making a point of not watching, though the shop was small enough that making a point of not watching required active effort. Evelyn set the letter down on the cutting table. Her aunt, it turned out, had not died leaving nothing. Her aunt had died leaving everything: the shop building, the inventory, the savings account at the Philadelphia Savings Institute, and a portfolio of municipal bonds that Evelyn had known nothing about because her aunt had been, in her lifetime, a woman who considered her financial arrangements private business and had maintained that position with considerable commitment. The total figure at the bottom of the letter, laid out in the careful columns of a firm that specialized in estate settlements, was enough that Evelyn read it 3 times before she was confident she was reading it correctly. It was more money than Harold Whitmore's entire merchant operation was likely worth. She sat down on the stool beside the cutting table, which she did not usually do in the middle of a workday, and stared at the wall. Margaret said, without turning around, "Good news or bad news?" Evelyn said out loud, "I don't know yet." She told Silas on Wednesday, when he came in. She handed him the letter without preamble, without writing any introduction, just handed it to him and watched him read it. He read it through once and then looked up at her. He wrote, "When did this arrive?" She wrote, "Monday." He wrote, "You've been thinking about it for 2 days." She wrote, "Yes." He wrote, "What are you thinking?" She had prepared for this question. She had spent 2 days preparing for it, in the way she prepared for things she wasn't sure of, by turning it over from every angle until she understood her own position well enough to state it. She wrote, "I could go back, take the inheritance, live comfortably in Philadelphia." Not comfortably, actually. Well. The figure in that letter would mean well. He read that. He didn't write anything yet. She wrote, "I'm not going to." He wrote, "Why?" She thought about the simple answer, which was true, and the complicated answer, which was also true but harder to write. She wrote the simple answer, "Because I'm not finished here." He wrote, "What are you not finished with?" She wrote, "Building." And then, "Also, I am not going to let Harold Whitmore watch me leave." He looked at what she'd written, and the corner of his mouth moved. She wrote, "That's petty. I know it's petty." He wrote, "It's not petty, it's accurate. There's a difference." She wrote, This is harder to say, I've been poor before. I've been comfortable before. The money is not what I came here for, and it's not what I'm staying for. What I'm staying for is something I don't have a word for yet, the thing that's being built." He read that slowly. He put the notebook down for a moment and looked at the window, and she let him, because she had learned that his thinking silences were not empty. They were where the real work happened. Then he picked up the notebook and wrote, "I want to say something, and I need you to know it's not because of the letter." She wrote, "I know." He wrote, "You know what I'm going to say?" She wrote, "I think so. Say it anyway." He wrote for longer than usual, pressing harder on the pencil the way he did when he was being very deliberate. He wrote, "I've been deaf my entire life. I spent my childhood watching people decide what I was capable of before I'd done anything to demonstrate it either way. I built the Rocking Bee into what it is specifically because I needed there to be something they had to look at, something they couldn't explain away. And I've been alone in that project for 14 years because the women I met either wanted to be accommodated in ways I couldn't manage, or they wanted to manage me, and I couldn't tell which was worse. I'm not a person who's easy to be around. I know that. I don't find it easy to be wrong. I get absorbed in problems and forget everything else. I have opinions about things that are probably too strong." He paused and wrote, "But I think we see each other accurately, and I think that's rare enough that it would be foolish to ignore it." She read it twice. She wrote, "You're not easy to be around." He wrote, "I know." She wrote, "You drove 8 miles through a Wyoming winter 3 times a week. I would like to put on record that that is not a small thing." He wrote, "It was not a small thing." She wrote, "What are you actually asking me?" He wrote, "I'm asking if you'll consider us, whatever that looks like, on whatever terms make sense." He paused. "I'm not asking you to need me. You clearly don't." She looked at him. She said out loud, into the thin, whispered air that was all her voice could manage now, "That's the right thing to say." He watched her mouth. He wrote, "I've been practicing." She laughed. She hadn't expected to laugh, and it came out surprised and genuine and slightly undignified, which she suspected was fine. She wrote, "I'll consider it." He wrote, "Good." There was that word again. She was going to have to make peace with how much that word did to her, she thought. The inheritance changed things in ways she hadn't fully anticipated, and not all of them were comfortable. She had told Margaret, because Margaret would hear anyway, and she preferred the truth to come directly. Margaret had received the information with the stillness of someone who was doing mathematics in her head, and then said, "You could open your own shop." Evelyn had looked at her. "Don't look at me like that," Margaret said. "You've been doing the better half of the work here for 3 months. I'm 62 years old, and my left knee is going to force me to make decisions I've been avoiding. This isn't me being selfless, it's me being practical." She picked up her thimble. "If you opened your shop here in Cedar Ridge, I would send you every customer who needs work beyond basic alterations, which is most of them, and I would sleep easier knowing the shop was in good hands when I eventually have to close." Evelyn wrote, "You're not closing." "Not tomorrow," Margaret agreed, "but eventually. The question is whether the work continues, whether the women in this town have somewhere to go for what they need." She paused. "You could do more than I've been able to do. You have ideas I've never had. That school you mentioned." Evelyn looked up sharply. She had mentioned the school once, in passing, 6 weeks ago, a vague idea she'd had about the possibility of teaching basic sewing and garment construction to women who wanted to earn independent income. She hadn't said much about it because it was still mostly an idea rather than a plan. "I listen," Margaret said, answering the unasked question, "even when people think I'm just sewing." The news that Evelyn Hartwell had come into money reached Cedar Ridge in the way that news about money always traveled in small towns: fast, slightly distorted, and with a strong opinion already attached to it by the time it arrived. She hadn't told anyone except Margaret, and Margaret hadn't said a word to anyone because Margaret was constitutionally incapable of gossip. But the law firm had written to confirm her reply, and the postmaster read every return address on every envelope that moved through Cedar Ridge as a professional habit, and the postmaster's wife had opinions about Evelyn that she had been refining since October, and the chain of transmission from there was short. Within a week, most of Cedar Ridge knew approximately what she'd inherited, with a margin of error in both directions that reflected the town's investment in the story. What interested Evelyn was Harold's reaction. She had expected him to be irritated. She had expected some kind of move, though she wasn't sure what shape it would take. What she hadn't expected was for him to come to the shop on a Thursday morning in early March with his hat in his hand and an expression she had never seen on his face before. He looked uncomfortable. Genuinely, specifically uncomfortable, in the way of a man who has done a calculation and arrived at a result he doesn't like. Margaret was there, at the back, visible through the open doorway. Harold came to the counter and said, "I'd like to speak to you." Evelyn looked at him and waited. "I've heard about your inheritance," he said. He was careful with his voice. "I want to say I owe you an apology for the station, for the meeting." He stopped. He seemed to be finding it difficult, which she believed, though she was less certain about what exactly was difficult about it, the apology itself or the circumstances that had made it necessary. "I misjudged you," he said, "in more ways than one." She picked up her chalk. She wrote, "Why are you apologizing now?" He had the decency to look at the floor for a moment. "That's fair," he said. "I won't pretend the timing is... I'm not trying to..." He stopped again and started over. "The truth is that I've been making decisions about people based on what I thought they could do for me or do to me, and it's a poor way to conduct yourself." She wrote, "Yes, it is." He looked at what she'd written. He nodded, one short movement. She wrote, "I accept your apology." And then, before he could change his expression, "I don't think we'll be friends, but I don't intend to spend energy being your enemy either. There are better uses for it." He read that. Something moved across his face that she couldn't entirely categorize. Relief, possibly, and something else underneath that she suspected was an emotion Harold Whitmore rarely let himself feel, which was smallness. The honest awareness of having been smaller than the situation required. "That's more generous than I deserve," he said. She wrote, "Probably. But I'm the one who gets to decide what to do with it." He left. She stood at the counter for a moment and then turned to find Margaret standing in the doorway with her arms folded. Margaret said, which covered everything. Spring in Wyoming arrived argumentatively, winter seeding ground day by day, and then taking it back, the temperature swinging 15 degrees in an afternoon, mud everywhere. the cattle restless with the change of season. Silas had told her the spring was the most demanding time on the ranch. Breeding decisions, fence repairs, the first round of cattle movement to the upper pastures, 100 problems that had been waiting politely under the snow and were now impatient. He came to town less frequently in March, and she missed him, which she allowed herself to acknowledge without making it into a larger thing than it was. She was busy too. She was making decisions. The building on the corner of 2nd Street had been empty since the previous tenant, a notary, had moved to Rawlins in November. She looked at it 3 times before she allowed herself to look at it seriously, and then she looked at it seriously for a week, walking past it in the morning, peering through the windows, doing the arithmetic. It was larger than Margaret's shop, with a front room that could fit 6 sewing stations, and a back room that might, with some arrangement, serve as a teaching space. She wrote to the law firm in Philadelphia and asked them to begin the process of releasing funds. She talked to the owner of the building, a man named Percival Oakes, who was 71, hard of hearing, and principally interested in whether she intended to make noise at night, which she assured him she didn't. She told Margaret. Margaret said, "Good," in a tone that suggested she had known this was coming for some time and had opinions about the decision that she chose to express in that single word. She told Silas by letter because he was out at the upper pasture with the spring cattle movement, and she wanted him to know before he heard it from someone else. She wrote it out longhand on good paper. She had bought good paper specifically, and sent it with Dot on her weekly town run. His reply came back in 3 days, written in the quick, firm handwriting he used when he had something to say and wanted to say it efficiently. "That's the right building. The light through the east windows in the morning is good. I noticed it when I passed it in January." And then, on the next line, "I want to see it when you've set it up." She read that twice. She thought about him riding past an empty building on a January morning in Cedar Ridge and noticing the quality of the morning light through the windows and thinking of her. She pressed the letter flat on her work table and looked at it. She wrote back, "You'll be the first one I show it to." The legal business of actually accessing the inheritance turned out to be slower and more tedious than she'd imagined. Letters went back and forth between Cedar Ridge and Philadelphia, with the unhurried pace of correspondence crossing 1,200 miles of American geography. There were documents to sign and documents to have witnessed, and a question about a secondary account that required clarification and then reclarification. She handled all of it herself, writing careful responses at her work table in the evenings by lamplight, learning more than she'd expected to about probate law and estate transfers. It was during this process, in the 3rd week of March, that she discovered something in the documents that stopped her. The law firm had included, as part of the estate inventory, a list of her aunt's business relationships and outstanding contracts. Her aunt had been meticulous in her record-keeping, which was one of the qualities Evelyn had most admired in her. Among the contracts was a lending agreement with a Philadelphia investment firm, and among the collateral items listed against that agreement was a notation that made Evelyn go back to the beginning of the document and read it again from the start. Her aunt had lent money. Not borrowed, lent. A substantial sum, 7 years prior, to a Western land development company that had been operating in Wyoming territory. The company's name was the Cedar Ridge Land and Development Corporation. Evelyn sat very still for a long time. She wrote to the law firm requesting the full documentation on that particular item. She waited 10 days for the reply. When it came, it was thick, more pages than she'd expected, with copies of the original agreement and the subsequent correspondence, and, at the back, a summary of the corporation's current status prepared by a firm that the lawyers had engaged to assess the estate's outstanding assets and liabilities. She read it twice, and then she walked to the shop. It was a Saturday morning in early April, cold but clear, the mud of March starting to firm up, and found Margaret and put the documents on the cutting table. "Read this," she said. Margaret read. Her expression, which was always difficult to read, became actively illegible, which meant she was thinking hard about something. "Harold Whitmore," Margaret said finally, not looking up from the pages, "is one of 3 principals of the Cedar Ridge Land and Development Corporation," Evelyn said. "Yes. And your aunt's estate holds a lending agreement against that corporation. An unpaid one. The repayment was due 18 months ago. According to the assessment at the back, the corporation has been in default since then." Margaret set the documents down. She looked at Evelyn. "Your aunt lent money to Harold's company. Harold's company hasn't paid it back, and now that debt is part of your inheritance. Which means Harold Whitmore owes me money, Evelyn said. A not small amount of money, which he has not paid, and which, as the inheritor of the estate, I am apparently entitled to pursue. The shop was very quiet. Margaret said, "Does he know?" "He knew about the lending agreement. Whether he knows the estate has transferred to me, whether he's done that arithmetic yet, I don't know." "It would explain," Margaret said slowly, "why he came here to apologize in March." Evelyn had been turning this over for 3 days. She wasn't certain. It was possible the apology had been genuine, or as genuine as Harold ever got. It was possible he had done the arithmetic and was managing her. It was possible both things were partially true, which was probably the most accurate version of most things involving Harold. She wrote, "I need to talk to Silas." Margaret said, "Yes, you do." He came to town the following Tuesday, and she could tell from the way he came through the door that he'd been told something already. His face had the quality it had when he was already thinking about a problem. Ray must have heard something, or Dot. Information in Cedar Ridge traveled its own paths, and she'd stopped being surprised by what arrived where. She handed him the documents without preamble. He sat at the counter and read through them with the thorough attention he gave to anything involving figures or legal language. She watched him read. She watched his jaw tighten when he got to the part about the Cedar Ridge Land and Development Corporation, and she watched him read it again more carefully. He looked up at her. He wrote, "How long have you known?" She wrote, 12 days. He wrote, "Why didn't you send word?" She wrote, "I needed to understand it fully first. I didn't want to bring you a half-formed problem." He wrote, "I want to know when you have a half-formed problem. That's not a thing you need to spare me." She looked at him. She wrote, "Noted." He wrote, "Harold's company has been using the land along the North Creek drainage as collateral on at least 2 separate agreements. I know this because I've been watching that land for 3 years. There's a section I want for expanded grazing, but the title has been unclear. If your aunt's agreement is senior," she wrote, "the lawyers say it's the earliest registered against that specific collateral. Yes." He looked at the ceiling for a moment, which was what he did when he was assembling pieces. He wrote, "Harold's company has been borrowing against land with clouded title," which means either he didn't know the title was clouded, or he did know and borrowed against it anyway and assumed nobody would check. She wrote, "Which do you think?" He wrote, "Harold is not stupid." She wrote, "No." He wrote, "This is more serious than a personal conflict. If he's been representing title he doesn't cleanly hold to secure lending agreements, that's fraud. That involves the land office. It involves Judge Mercer, which is a problem, but it also involves the Territorial Land Commission, which Harold doesn't control." She wrote, "I haven't decided what to do yet." He wrote, "What are your options as you see them?" She thought about how she wanted to answer that. She had been thinking about it for 12 days, and she still wasn't certain, which was unusual for her. She was generally a person who arrived at clarity through sustained thought. This problem resisted clarity because it had too many layers, each one carrying a different kind of weight. She wrote, "I could pursue the debt quietly, negotiate a repayment, take the money and let the rest of it alone." He wrote, "That benefits you financially and doesn't resolve the title problem or the fraud." She wrote, "I could refer the documents to the Territorial Land Commission and let them investigate." He wrote, "That exposes Harold to serious legal consequences, possibly criminal. And it benefits the territory generally, but it also benefits me specifically because the title question on that North Creek land gets resolved." She wrote, "Is that a conflict of interest for you?" He looked at her directly. He wrote, "Yes, which is why I'm telling you rather than pushing you toward it." She had expected that answer, but she still sat with it for a moment, because it was the kind of answer that told you something about a person. She wrote, "There's a third option." He wrote, "What is it?" She wrote, "I could go to Harold directly, show him what I have, tell him what I'm considering, give him the chance to respond before I do anything." He wrote, "Why would you do that?" She wrote, "Because I told him in March that I didn't intend to be his enemy. Because I'm not certain the apology was entirely strategic. Some of it might have been real. And because the kind of person I want to be is someone who gives people the chance to be better than their worst decisions before I decide to bring consequences down on them." He read that for a long time. He wrote, "That's more generous than most people would be." She wrote, I told Margaret the same thing in October. The answer is the same. I'm the one who gets to decide what to do with it. He wrote, yes. She wrote, I'm not naive about what he might do with that chance. He might try to manage me again. He might go to Judge Mercer first and try to get ahead of it. I'm not going in without documentation, and I'm not going in alone. He wrote, who are you going in with? She wrote, you, if you're willing. He looked at her. He wrote, when? She wrote, Thursday. He wrote, I'll be here. 13. Thursday morning arrived with the particular clarity of April in Wyoming after a wet week. The air washed clean, the light sharp, the mud finally drying at the edges. Evelyn was at the shop by 7. She had the documents in a leather case that had belonged to her aunt and still had her aunt's initials pressed into the flap, which she found appropriate in a way she couldn't entirely articulate. Silas was at the shop by 8, coat buttoned, hat in hand, expression the one he wore when he had decided on a course of action and was simply executing it. Margaret looked at both of them. I'll be here when you get back, she said, which was Margaret's way of saying everything else. Harold Whitmore's establishment was the largest on the main street, which he had arranged intentionally, the merchant's storefront on the ground floor, his offices above, the whole thing presenting a face of prosperity and permanence that had been his primary project for as long as anyone in Cedar Ridge could remember. He was there when they arrived. His clerk tried to intercept them at the door and then took one look at Silas Bennett's expression and reconsidered. Harold was at his desk. He looked up when they came in, and she watched his face assemble the same rapid sequence of calculations she'd seen there before, reading the room, reading the documents under her arm, reading the combination of the two people in front of him and what it was likely to mean. He said, Miss Hartwell. He said, Silas. His voice was very controlled. She set the leather case on his desk without sitting down. She took the documents out and placed them in front of him. You know what these are, she said. He looked at them. He looked at her. He said, I'd heard the estate had been transferred. Then you know what I hold, she said. He was quiet for a moment. He was good at silence. Harold. He used it the way some people used words, as a way of maintaining position while he figured out his next move. But this silence had a different quality than the one she'd seen from him before. There was something in it that was less calculated and more genuinely uncertain. What are you planning to do? He said. She looked at him steadily. Beside her, Silas stood with his arms at his sides, not making any move, not needing to. His presence was its own statement. I'm going to give you the chance to answer that question yourself, she said. What are you planning to do? Harold Whitmore looked at the documents on his desk. He looked at the two people standing in front of him, the woman he'd sent away from a train platform 8 months ago and the rancher he'd spent years trying to diminish, and the arithmetic of the moment appeared to complete itself in his expression. His shoulders dropped, slightly. The performance of largeness he'd been maintaining for as long as anyone had known him seemed, for just a moment, to require more energy than he had available. He said, I think we should sit down. They sat. Harold took the chair behind his desk, which was the chair of a man in his own territory, and Evelyn and Silas took the 2 chairs across from him, which were the chairs of people who had come with documentation and did not need the advantage of geography. The office was well appointed in the way of Harold's everything. Good furniture, a carpet that had been brought from somewhere east, framed certificates on the wall that established his membership in various commercial associations. All of it designed to communicate that this was a place where serious men conducted serious business, and the terms were Harold's terms. It wasn't working the way it usually worked. Evelyn could see Harold feeling that, the way you feel a familiar tool that has stopped behaving predictably. She had been in this man's orbit for 8 months. She had been rejected by him, managed by him, threatened by him in the indirect ways available to people who want to harm you without leaving fingerprints. And she had spent the last 12 days deciding, very carefully, who she intended to be in this room. She was not here for revenge. She had examined that impulse honestly, because it was present. It would have been dishonest to pretend otherwise. And she had decided it wasn't useful. Revenge required ongoing investment in Harold Whitmore, and she had better things to invest in. She was here for resolution. Those were different projects. The lending agreement, Harold said, looking at the documents she'd laid in front of him, was a legitimate commercial arrangement. I want to be clear about that. She wrote on the small notepad she'd brought, I know. My aunt was a legitimate commercial lender. That's not what's in question. Harold read it. He looked at Silas briefly, and Silas looked back at him with the steady patience of a man who had spent his entire life waiting for other people to get to the point. The default, Harold said, was a cash flow issue. The corporation had several simultaneous obligations that, she wrote, Mr. Whitmore. I didn't come here to hear an explanation of the default. I came to discuss the title documentation. Harold stopped. She watched him decide how to handle this, whether to continue the performance of confidence or to cut it, whether he thought there was still enough room to maneuver that the performance was worth maintaining. She watched him read the documents again, specifically the section regarding the collateral, and she watched the moment when he arrived at the conclusion she'd arrived at 12 days ago. He set the papers down. He said, "How did you find it?" "The estate inventory was thorough," she said. "My aunt was a thorough woman." Harold was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The North Creek parcels." The title question. Silas reached across and wrote on her notepad, which she pushed toward Harold. 3 separate borrowing agreements. At least 2 of them represent the same parcels as collateral. That's not a title question. That's a documentation problem that becomes a legal problem depending on whether anyone looks carefully. Harold read Silas's handwriting. His jaw tightened. Those agreements were made in good faith. Silas wrote, "Good faith doesn't clean a title." The room was very quiet. Somewhere below, in the storefront, they could hear the muffled sounds of commerce. A customer, the clerk's voice. The ordinary business of a Thursday morning in a merchant's establishment. The ordinary life Harold had built, going on without him, while he sat upstairs and looked at the thing that could unravel it. Evelyn had thought about this moment. She had thought about what it would feel like to be the one holding the leverage, after 8 months of being the one without it. She had expected it to feel more satisfying. What it actually felt like was complicated and slightly exhausting, which she supposed was the difference between imagining power and actually having to decide what to do with it. She wrote, "Here's what I'm proposing. The corporation will repay the lending agreement in full, with the accrued interest the lawyers have calculated, within 90 days. In return, I will not refer the title documentation to the Territorial Land Commission at this time." She paused, then wrote, "Additionally, and this is separate, the North Creek section that Silas has been trying to acquire for 3 years will be sold to him at fair market value, with clean title, within the same 90 days. Harold read it. He read it again. He said, "That section is part of the corporation's assets. I can't unilaterally." She wrote, "You are one of 3 principals. Arrange it with the other 2. You have 90 days. And if I can't arrange it in that time..." She looked at him steadily. She wrote, "Then I refer the documentation to the Territorial Commission and let them determine what should happen next. I'm not trying to destroy you, Mr. Whitmore, but I'm also not going to pretend this isn't what it is." Harold looked at the documents. He looked at the 2 people across his desk. He had the expression of a man counting options and finding fewer than he'd started with. He said, "I'll need to contact my partners." She wrote, "Of course." He said, "This isn't... I want you to know that the original arrangement with your aunt was never intended to..." She wrote, "I believe you. People don't usually intend the problems they create. They just don't manage them responsibly once they've created them." She met his eyes. "I'm giving you 90 days to manage this one responsibly. That's more than you gave me on a train platform." Harold Whitmore looked at Evelyn Hartwell for a long moment. 8 months ago, he had looked at her from 20 feet away on a platform in the cold and decided in 30 seconds what she was worth and what she was capable of. He had been wrong about both, and the cost of being wrong was sitting across his desk in a leather case with her aunt's initials on the flap. 90 days, he said. She wrote, "I'll have my lawyers confirm the terms in writing by next week." She put the documents back in the case and stood up, and Silas stood with her, and they walked out of Harold Whitmore's office and down the stairs and out into the April morning, and the door closed behind them with a perfectly ordinary sound. They walked half a block before either of them did anything, and then Silas stopped and she stopped beside him, and they stood there on the main street of Cedar Ridge in the clear spring light with nothing particular to say. He wrote in the notebook, "You handled that well." She wrote back, "My hands are shaking." He looked at her hands. They were, in fact, shaking, a fine tremor she'd been controlling since they sat down in Harold's office, and that had apparently decided now was the time to announce itself. He closed his notebook. He reached over and put his hand over hers, the way he'd taken her hand in the Grange Hall in February. Plain and deliberate, not a performance, just a fact. She let out a breath she'd been holding since Thursday morning. "I need to sit down," she said. He looked around. The nearest option was the bench outside the general store, where old men sat in the afternoons to discuss things. At this hour it was empty. They sat on it, in the April sunlight, and she was aware of how they must look to anyone passing. A peculiar pair, the whispering woman from Philadelphia and the deaf rancher from 8 miles north, sitting on a bench in the middle of the morning like two people who had just finished something difficult and needed a moment. She didn't particularly care. She wrote, "Do you think he'll do it?" He wrote, "I think Harold will do whatever preserves Harold. The terms you offered preserve Harold. So yes." She wrote, "Does it bother you that he gets to preserve himself?" He thought about that honestly, which was the only way Silas thought about things. He wrote, "Less than I expected. I wanted the North Creek land. I'm going to get it with clean title. The rest of it, what Harold feels, whether he learned anything, that's not mine to manage." He paused. "You?" She looked at the main street of Cedar Ridge, the street she had walked up 8 months ago with a trunk and aching arms and $11.40. The street she had walked to work on every day since, in sun and mud and snow. The street that now contained, on the corner of 2nd, a building with good east-facing light that had her name on a lease agreement signed 2 weeks ago. She wrote, "I'm more interested in what comes next than in whether Harold learned a lesson." He wrote, "What comes next?" She wrote, "The shop, the school, you." He looked at those 3 words for a moment. He wrote, "In that order?" She wrote, "They're not in competition." He wrote, "Good." The shop on 2nd Street opened on the 15th of May, which was later than she'd planned because the floor needed replacing, and the man she'd hired to replace it had a philosophical approach to deadlines that she eventually stopped arguing with and simply managed around. Margaret came with a bottle of something a neighbor had made that was technically whiskey and was certainly strong, and Dot came from the ranch with a jar of honey and a card signed by the 11 full-time Rocking Bee hands, 3 of whom had clearly been coached on what to write, and 2 of whom had apparently improvised, resulting in 1 card that ranged from formal to unexpectedly sentimental within the span of 4 sentences. Silas came. He was the first one there, as she had promised he would be, arriving while she was still arranging the work tables and the morning light was doing exactly what he'd said it would do, through the east windows, coming in clean and long, laying across the floor in a way that made the space look both larger and warmer than it was. He stood in the doorway and looked at it. She watched him look. There was something about watching someone see a thing you've built, the moment before they say anything, when their face is just receiving it honestly. She had worked for this, the lease, the floor, the work tables, the 6 new spools of quality thread arranged by weight on the shelf she'd built herself with moderate success, and 3 wasted boards. She had worked for it carefully and sometimes desperately, and always with the specific intention of a woman who had decided something and was going to do it. He wrote, "This is good work." She wrote, "The floor is uneven in the back left corner." He wrote, "You'll fix it eventually." She wrote, "Yes." He looked at the space again and then at her, and he wrote, "How does it feel?" She thought about that question. She thought about the train platform and the back room at Margaret's, and the 2 rooms above the harness makers, and the Grange Hall in February, and Harold's office last Thursday. She thought about everything that had accumulated between arriving in Cedar Ridge with nothing except her skills and her stubbornness, and this morning, standing in a room that was hers. She wrote, "Like I'm exactly where I decided to be." He read that. He put the notebook away. He walked across the uneven floor to where she was standing, and he looked at her the way he'd been looking at her since October, with the full attention of a person who had decided she was worth looking at. And she looked back at him in the same way because she had made the same decision. He raised his hand and signed something. She didn't know enough of his language yet to read it, which he apparently anticipated, because he followed it immediately with the notebook. "I've been trying to figure out how to say this without writing it." She wrote, "What does it mean, what you signed?" He wrote, "Roughly, you are someone I want to keep knowing." She looked at that. She wrote, "Teach me to sign it." He did. Standing in the morning light of the shop on 2nd Street, he showed her the shape of it, patient and unhurried, her hands in his, correcting the position of her fingers until the movement was right. She got it wrong twice and right the third time, and when she signed it back to him, his expression did the thing it did when something caught him by surprise, the real smile that arrived before he decided whether to let it. She thought about what it meant, this particular kind of knowing, the kind built from notebook pages and chalk dust and winter drives, and a handshake in a half-empty hall, and two people who had both spent years being misread by people who couldn't be bothered to read carefully. It wasn't simple. It wasn't going to become simple. He was, as he had told her himself, not easy to be around, and she was, as she knew herself to be, a person with a streak of stubbornness that hardship had made almost structural. They were going to disagree about things. They already had disagreed, about the Herald situation specifically. Silas had wanted to go to the Territorial Commission immediately, and she had overruled him, and he had not entirely accepted this without argument, though he had accepted it. That was fine. She didn't need someone who agreed with everything she thought. She had had enough of people who managed her instead of engaging with her to last the rest of her life. The school began in September with 7 students. This was fewer than she'd hoped, and more than Margaret had predicted, which meant they were both partially right, which Evelyn decided to call a reasonable outcome. The students were women ranging in age from 17 to 53, brought together by different circumstances but a shared need. They wanted work they could do on their own terms, skills that belonged to them, something that didn't depend on a husband or a father or the goodwill of an employer who could revoke it. She taught 3 mornings a week in the back room of the 2nd Street shop. Basic construction first, straight seams, proper pressing, the geometry of a flat pattern becoming a 3-dimensional thing. Then fitting, which was harder and more important. Then the business of it, pricing work fairly, keeping records, dealing with customers who wanted too much for too little. She wrote most of the instruction on a large chalkboard she'd had mounted on the back wall, because her voice couldn't carry clearly in a room of 7 people, and she had stopped pretending it could. Some of the students had initially been uncertain about this method. By the 3rd week they had all adapted, which she found said more about human adaptability than she could have articulated. Dot was one of the students. This had surprised Evelyn until Dot explained, with her characteristic economy, that she'd been cooking and cleaning for the Rocking Bee for 11 years, and was thinking about what the years after that might look like, and sewing seemed like something that traveled. Also, Dot said, Silas told me it was worth doing. He doesn't say that about things unless he means it. Evelyn wrote, no, he doesn't. The Grange, which had been Harold Whitmore's meeting place in February, hosted the school's first public display of work in October. Garments made by the students, hung on a temporary rack, available for the town to look at. Evelyn had proposed this to the Grange president, a practical woman named Ruth Adler, who had been looking for ways to use the hall more and found the proposal straightforward. The display drew more people than any of them had expected, partly because Cedar Ridge was a small town, and things to attend were always welcome, and partly because the work was genuinely good. Clara Hutchins came. She examined every garment carefully and then came to find Evelyn and said, I'd like to enroll next term, with the air of someone making a business decision rather than a personal one, which Evelyn respected more than effusive enthusiasm. There's a waiting list, Evelyn told her. Clara looked surprised, then didn't. Of course there is, she said. Put me on it. Harold's partners in the Cedar Ridge Land and Development Corporation turned out to be 2 men who, upon being presented with the documentation and the terms, agreed with a speed that suggested they had been waiting for an exit from an uncomfortable situation. The repayment arrived in installments over 80 days, just inside the deadline, in the form of a bank draft from the corporate account that was, according to her Philadelphia lawyers, entirely legitimate and correctly executed. The North Creek land transferred to Silas on the 83rd day, with clean title confirmed by the Territorial Land Office after a review that took 3 weeks and found, as Evelyn's lawyers had indicated it would find, a documentation irregularity that was corrected in the process. Silas had the deed recorded at the county courthouse in Rawlins and brought a copy to show her, which he set on her work table with no particular ceremony. She looked at it. She wrote, How does it feel? He wrote, Like a problem that took too long to solve finally being solved. She wrote, No more poetic than that? He wrote, I'm a practical man. She wrote, You are not entirely a practical man. He considered this. He wrote, The practical part is on top, the rest is there. It just doesn't lead. She looked at him. She thought about what it meant, that arrangement of practical on top and everything else underneath. And she thought about how well she understood it, because she had been built the same way, necessity teaching her to lead with capability and keep the rest protected until she was certain it was safe. She had been certain for some time now. She wrote, I want to ask you something. He wrote, Yes. She wrote, In October, when you came into Margaret's shop the first time, when you pulled out the notebook and I understood what was happening, I had a thought. I didn't say it to anyone. I barely said it to myself. He wrote, What was the thought? She wrote, I thought, here is someone who has had to find his own way to communicate with a world that wasn't built for him. And I thought, I know something about that. He was very still, reading. She wrote, I didn't know yet that it would become this. I just knew that I was tired of every conversation costing me something. The voice, the pity, the recalibration on their faces. And here was a conversation that cost me nothing. Here was someone who couldn't hear the wrong thing in my voice because he couldn't hear my voice at all. And I could hear his silence the same way he heard mine, as information, not absence. He put his hand flat on the notebook. He looked at her. She wrote, I'm saying I want to marry you. I'm aware that's unconventional, the woman saying it. I don't particularly care. He sat very still for a moment. Then he reached for the notebook. He wrote, I was going to ask you at Christmas. She wrote, It's October. He wrote, I was prepared to wait. She wrote, Why Christmas? He wrote, I thought you might need more time to be sure. She wrote, I've been sure since February. He wrote, The Grange meeting. She wrote, You took my hand. He wrote, Yes. She wrote, That was not the action of a man who was undecided. He wrote, No, it was not. They looked at each other across the work table in the Second Street shop in the afternoon light, with the chalkboard behind her still bearing the morning's lesson on seam allowances and the smell of good wool and machine oil in the air and the sound of Cedar Ridge going about its business in the street outside. He wrote, Yes. The answer is yes, since we're being direct. She wrote, Good. They married in the last week of November, in the front room of the Second Street shop because it was the largest space either of them owned in town, and because neither of them wanted a church, and neither of them wanted a production. The justice of the peace was a compact, efficient man named Howard Briggs who performed the legal portion in 11 minutes and seemed to consider this an achievement. Margaret was there. Ray and Nora were there. Dot was there, with the jar of honey she apparently brought to every significant occasion. The 7 women from the school's first term were there, and Clara Hutchins, who had been added to the second term and had approached all of it with the same business decision energy she'd applied to the waiting list. Alma from the hotel. A handful of ranchers and their wives who had been doing business with Silas for years and had watched the whole year unfold with the attention of people invested in the outcome. Harold Whitmore sent a card. She had not expected this. The card said, in Harold's neat commercial handwriting, Congratulations. I wish you both well. Nothing more than that. She showed it to Silas, who read it and put it down and wrote, Progress. She wrote, Do you think he means it? He wrote, I think he means it as much as he's capable of meaning things that require him to acknowledge he was wrong, which is partial. But partial is better than nothing. She wrote, That's more generous than I expected from you. He wrote, You've been a moderating influence. She wrote, Moderation is not the word anyone would use to describe me. He wrote, No. But you've taught me that most people are several things at once, Harold included. She looked at him. She thought about what it took, what it had taken, over 1 year in Cedar Ridge, to arrive at a position where she could hold that thought without bitterness. It hadn't happened cleanly. There were still mornings when she thought about the train platform with a cold anger that hadn't entirely burned out. There were still moments when someone in town leaned in to hear her, and the old strain moved through her, the particular exhaustion of a life that required more effort to navigate than it should. But the anger had stopped being the loudest thing. That was the change. Not that it was gone. She wasn't built for the kind of peace that requires you to pretend things didn't happen. But it had settled into the appropriate proportion, the way a wound settles into a scar. Present, not in charge. In The winter was hard, as Wyoming winters always were, but the Rocking Bee was better positioned for it than it had been in years. The North Creek section, now properly titled, gave Silas the expanded pasture access he'd been working toward, and the cattle numbers going into winter were the best Ray could remember since before the bad year of 1886. Evelyn spent the cold months between the Second Street shop and the ranch, the proportion shifting gradually in the direction of the ranch, because the ranch was where Silas was, and she was not someone who believed that living apart from the person you'd chosen was a virtue that needed performing. She set up a work table in the room off the main house that Silas had used for storage and calculations, a room with 2 good windows and space for a sewing machine once she arranged the freight for one. She worked there on winter mornings while he worked at the desk across from her on the accounts and the breeding records and the 1,000 ongoing problems of running a complex enterprise. They were in the same room, each absorbed in different work, passing the notebook back and forth when something came up that required communication. And she found this, the simple fact of it, 2 people working separately but together, to be something she had wanted without knowing she wanted it for a very long time. It was not a seamless life. The 8 miles between the ranch and town were a genuine inconvenience that no amount of goodwill could reduce. She made the trip 3 times a week for the shop and the school, and in bad weather it was sometimes 4 miles of poor road and ice before the main track improved, and there were mornings when she arrived at the Second Street shop cold to the bone and in a temper that required a cup of Margaret's coffee, and 15 minutes before she was fit for customers. Silas was, as he had told her himself, not easy to be around when he was absorbed in a problem, and there were evenings when she had spoken 3 sentences into the air before she remembered he couldn't hear them, and then had to decide whether the sentences were worth writing down, and sometimes they were and sometimes they weren't, and learning the difference was its own ongoing project. They argued about the school in January. Silas thought the pace was too slow. Too few students per term, too much of her time on basics, not enough expansion. She thought he was applying ranch economics to an educational project, and that the two were not analogous. They went back and forth on this, in writing, for 3 days, which was longer than any disagreement they'd had so far, and at the end of it she adjusted the term length and he acknowledged that the comparison to cattle operations had been reductive, and neither of them entirely backed down, which was, she decided, the appropriate resolution to a real disagreement between people who both had strong ideas and were not going to stop having them. She told Margaret about it on a February morning, sitting in the old shop where Margaret was still taking simple alterations and absolutely refusing to fully retire. Margaret said, "Did you resolve it?" "Partially," Evelyn said. "That's marriage," Margaret said, pushing her needle through the cloth some. In the spring of 1889, Evelyn expanded the school to 2 terms running simultaneously, a morning group and an afternoon group, 12 students total, with a second instructor she'd identified in the first term's graduates, a woman named Patience Lark, who had an aptitude for teaching that exceeded her aptitude for sewing, which was already considerable. The school had, over 2 terms, produced women who were taking private orders, one who had opened her own small operation in a town 20 miles east, and 3 who had found work at a clothing manufacturer in Cheyenne. These were not large numbers. Evelyn was under no illusion about the scale of what she was doing. The frontier was wide and the need was vast, and 12 students per term was a modest response to an immodest problem. But she had learned, through the fever, through the train platform, through 11 months of building in Cedar Ridge, that the modest response done consistently and well had a compounding quality that the dramatic gesture never quite managed. You did the thing in front of you. You did it properly. You built from it. The Rocking Bee had its best year in the spring and summer of 1889. Silas didn't say much about it directly. He wasn't a man who celebrated his own outcomes with noise. But she knew from Ray and from the figures she'd seen on the account books that the North Creek expansion had made a measurable difference in the operation's capacity, and that the difference would compound forward the same way everything else did. She thought about this one evening in June, sitting on the porch of the main house with the long western light coming across the pasture and the sound of the cattle settling in the middle distance. Silas was beside her. They had developed a porch habit, an hour in the evenings when neither of them was working, which had required active enforcement in the early months because both of them defaulted to finding something else to do. She had been the one to establish the rule, and Silas had complied with it while maintaining that it was inefficient and then had stopped complaining about it somewhere in March without announcing that he'd changed his position, which she chose not to mention. He wrote in the notebook, "What are you thinking about?" She wrote, "Compounding." He wrote, "The accounts?" She wrote, "Everything, the accounts, the school, this." She gestured, meaning the porch, meaning the evening, meaning all of it. How small things done consistently become large things without any single moment where the change happens. He looked at what she'd written. He wrote, "The North Creek fence took me 3 weeks. I fixed one section, came back and fixed the next, came back and fixed the next. There was no moment where the fence was whole. It was broken, and then it was fixed." She wrote, "That's exactly what I mean." He wrote, "Is it satisfying, the way it happened?" She thought about the honest answer, which was what she always tried to give him because he always gave it to her. She wrote, "Yes and no. I would have preferred less to build from. I would have preferred not to lose my voice. I would have preferred to arrive in Cedar Ridge under different circumstances, to build from something better than nothing and nowhere." She paused. "But I don't think I would trade what I built for what I might have had. And I'm not sure those two things can coexist. What you build from the wreckage of something, and what you might have had if there had been no wreckage." He read that slowly. He wrote, "I was angry for a long time, about being deaf, about what it cost me in the early years, the things people decided about me before I demonstrated anything." He stopped writing for a moment, tapping the pencil against the page. "At some point I realized the anger was accurate but not useful. What I had was what I had. The question was what to make of it." She wrote, "What did you make of it?" He looked up from the notebook. He looked at the pasture, at the long light, at the cattle moving slow in the distance. He looked at her. He wrote, "This." She looked at that word. One word, as usual with him. He was not a man who used more than he needed. She wrote, "That's enough." He wrote, "Yes." The light went slower across the pasture, the long Wyoming summer evening doing what it did, taking its time about becoming dark. The cattle sounds settled. Somewhere out in the north section a horse was moving, probably Fletcher, who had an opinion about the evening hours and expressed it through motion. She thought about what she would have told herself if she could have spoken to the woman standing on that train platform in October 1887 with the crowd watching and Harold Whitmore's back disappearing down the steps. She thought about what that woman could have heard in that specific moment that would have helped her. Not the outcome. The outcome would have seemed too improbable. The shop, the school, the ranch, Silas, and improbable outcomes offered to a person in the middle of a disaster don't comfort, they confuse. You can't use a destination when you don't know how to get there yet. What she would have said was simpler. She would have said, "Don't get back on the train." That was it. That was the whole instruction. Everything else. Margaret and the back room, the notebook passing back and forth across the counter, the chalk on the Grange Hall board, the leather case with her aunt's initials, the morning light through the east windows of the 2nd Street shop. All of it had come from that one decision, the decision to stay in the place that had tried to turn her away and build something there that couldn't be turned away. She hadn't known she was capable of it that October morning. She had suspected she was, the way you suspect things about yourself that haven't been tested yet. The testing had told her she was right. That was the other thing she understood now, looking back across a year and some months of it. The testing is the point, not the proof of something you already knew, the actual finding out. You don't know what you're made of until the situation requires you to be made of it. And the situation in Cedar Ridge, Wyoming, in October 1887, had required her to be made of more than she'd thought she had, and she had discovered, section by section, in the way of a fence being fixed in 3-week increments, that she had enough. She had more than enough. Beside her, Silas had closed the notebook. The evening was doing its slow work. She could see the North Creek section from the porch on a clear evening, the line of the new fence just visible at the edge of the near pasture, the land that was now cleanly his stretching out beyond it in the late gold light. She reached over and put her hand on his arm, and he turned and looked at her, and she signed to him, the sign he had taught her in the October morning light of the shop on 2nd Street, correcting her hands until the movement was right. "You are someone I want to keep knowing." He looked at her hands. He looked at her face. He signed it back. They sat on the porch of the Rocking Bee in the long Wyoming evening, two people who had been told, separately and persistently, what they could not do and what they could not be, and had decided together that the people doing the telling were simply wrong. They had not proven it in a single moment. They had not defeated anyone in a grand confrontation or a dramatic stand. They had done it the way most true things get done, incrementally, imperfectly, through the sustained application of effort and judgment, and the particular stubbornness of people who have decided not to be defeated. Cedar Ridge would remember them both for a long time, not as a legend, not as a story people told to prove something, just as themselves. The woman with the whispering voice who opened a shop on 2nd Street and taught 12 women a term to make something from nothing. The deaf rancher with the best operation in the county and the fence you could see from the road, straight and solid and built to last. Two people who had arrived at the same understanding from different directions. That the life you build in the place that tried to reject you is worth more than any life you might have been handed. And that sometimes the people who push you out the door are, without meaning to, pushing you directly toward the thing you were always supposed to build.